recording and open it up. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So go ahead and release them in. That'd be great, Robert. Thank you. So welcome this to our Foreign Trade Association second part on the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. We're letting people in here. We'll get started here in just a moment, but we'd ask that you have your cameras off and your microphones on mute, and we'll get started in just a minute. Thank you again for joining. We got people still joining us here. We'll get started in just a few minutes after the top of the hour as people click in, and we'd ask that you have your cameras off and your microphones on mute, and we will get started in a moment. We will be recording today's seminar, so you'll have that record, and give it just a little bit more time. There's also a number of documents that were sent to you by email and also in the chat that are references for you to review in relationship to the presentation that was previously made, but feel free to look at that. And then also for those of you who attended Tuesday's webinar, that is currently on the FTA YouTube site, so you can review that there as well. So it is 11:02. We have a number of people here, and respecting other people's times, we'll get started. So I'm Mark Hersel, with American Honda Motor Company. It's my privilege as the president and the chair of the programs committee of your Foreign Trade Association to introduce to you today's webinar. Again, if you're not presented, we ask that you turn off your camera and mute your microphones. If you are a member of the Foreign Trade Association, you're enjoying this seminar free of charge and part of your membership benefits. And if you find our webinars of value, it's just one of the many membership benefits, and we encourage you to sign up and join us today. I want to thank Elva Milton and TJ and Bob from their presentations on Tuesday, sharing CBP's message on the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act and the DHS Forced Labor Enforcement Strategy. So in the next couple of weeks, things that are coming up, if you haven't already signed up for the 2022 Trade Facilitation and Cargo Security Summit, July 18 through 20, there still are some reservations available for virtual attendance. So Ed, we'd invite you to put your microphone on mute if you could, please. So that's coming up. Sign up for that. The virtual seats are still available. We are having there's a few seats available for the FTA Customs House Broker Test Preparation class. First class is on July 25th, so time is shortening on that one, so sign up today. And also an in-person mixer at the Hub on July 28th. And we're looking to do a comprehensive FDA-focused webinar, a little longer than normal, sometime in September, but more details coming up on that. If you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll either incorporate it into the discussion or open it up at the end. There will be a recording of this event on our YouTube channel, so you can listen to it at a later time. So again, this is a part 2 from our session done on Tuesday. And our speakers today literally need no introduction. All are recognized experts on U.S. customs regulations and active and COAC and other international trade associations. All have been lifetime board members of the Foreign Trade Association and supporters of our group. It's kind of like introducing Beyonce, Bono, and Kanye. I'll let you pick out, who's who, but Michael Roll is the founder and managing partner of Roll and Harris. Previously to establishing a law practice, Michael had 25 years experience in the private sector. Richard Wortman is the managing partner for the Los Angeles office of Grunfeld, Desiderio, Leibowitz, Silverman, and Kleitstadt, with over 35 years of international trade law experience. And Sue Ross is a partner with over 45 years experience in Mitchell, Silverberg, and Knupp. So in short, we have gathered here well over 100 years of legal experience to help guide you through the challenges of this new regulation. But this is not, and Beyonce, this is not legal advice. This is not legal advice. This is not legal advice. These are just the thoughts and musings of some very well-educated and thoughtful people. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sue.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mark. And I don't know who said it, but I'm Beyonce. If there's any, sorry, that's how we're doing it, guys. I'm claiming that mantle. So what we thought we would do today is, first of all, we're not going to give you any slides because we thought it would be most useful if we talk about the issues, give you some illustrations about some of the things that are going on, and then get to the sort of compliance and best practices tips that we have for you. We're also going to assume that you listened to the presentation on Tuesday. A couple of key points would, of course, be no, Customs does not have authorization to move the effective date. In fact, Customs' role regarding forced labor is one of implementation and not policy because of the way in which the law was written. And probably most importantly, the thing that will impact everybody to the extent that there is broad impact, and there will be, is while the Forced Labor Act was looked at from the perspective and written from the perspective of trying to eliminate the forced labor that is occurring in the Uyghur region, because it talks about all or substantially all, there is no de minimis rule. So there is no, gee, I have a 10-cent nut in here that might have been made with forced labor, and I can therefore say it's de minimis and I get my goods in. I think the one thing that I found the most surprising from what Elva had to say on Tuesday was they are assuming, they meaning Customs, assume that you as an importer or you as a service provider to an importer will have at your fingertips, meaning you've already collected and put in place all the documents you need. And of course, we know that's not going to happen. So what we're going to do today is, first of all, Richard is going to talk about one of the two documents that are key to this discussion, and that is the CBP guidance document. Mike is then going to talk about the DHS guidance that was published. And then we're going to talk a little bit about having sort of set the table a little bit more further in more further detail. We're going to talk a bit about, okay, so this is what they're asking for. How do you go about handling this? What can you do? What are some of the tips that should be occurring? And so, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point, if you would, and let's just talk about the CBP guidance document that came out last Wednesday, was it, or Thursday?
Thank you, Sue. So for everybody who's watching, this is the document. It has been provided to everyone, I believe, by email, and there's a link to it in the chat. This document is more operational than substantive. It tells you what you have to do if your goods are stopped, detained, and so forth. I want to go through some key points. What I am not going to do, and I'm going to leave to my co-panelists, is kind of get into the meat of how you dig down and challenge Customs if that's your choice. So although we assume that you saw Elva's presentation earlier this week, we do want to just give a one-moment intro. The act went into effect actually on my birthday of last year. It was a surprise present to all of us. Essentially, it raised the bar or raised the standard on any merchandise in whole or in part from Xinjiang to a presumption that it is, for lack of a better legal term, it is bad. It is bad unless you can prove by clear and convincing evidence it didn't come in whole or in part. As Sue mentioned, there is no de minimis rule. So as a result, and let's just use a working example that everybody can relate to. A shirt. A shirt may be made of cloth, it may have buttons, and essentially If the buttons are bad, the entire shirt is bad. Having said that, I want to refer back to Elva's talk on Tuesday, where she was very clear, at least at this juncture, Customs is not going to tell you what piece was bad, and you need to know your entire supply chain about the entire product or garment. I think that it's also helpful, at least from the point of view of a practitioner, to note we haven't seen any of goods either detained or even questioned for this. And as Elba discussed the other day, and that's just a function of timing, and we would expect to see the earliest shipments by water till the inspections took place and so forth, another couple of weeks. She did comment that there have been at least 1 or 2 land or air shipments that have, I believe she said that they were turned around, but I would not swear on them.
Yeah, you're right, Richard. What she said was that they had a couple of them where they were excluded and exported.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Sue. So I think that everybody needs to understand that the enforcement process starts with customs targeting. And customs has a very robust targeting. As we all understand, the information can come from customs gathering information, it can come from non-governmental organizations, it can come from public source information, such as the Twitters and equivalents of the world. The act also began, and Customs notes this in the document, that there were letters sent out to a number. The number, as I understand it, is over 2,000 letters went out, either to people who had shipments whose MID was Xinjiang, or had some sort of other input that was known to be from Xinjiang. So when this process starts rolling and Customs applies this information, Customs can do one of essentially 4 things. One, they can decide, you know, we don't have enough information, we're just going to immediately, we're not going to stop these goods. They could detain them. As a process matter, slightly different than our other day-to-day detentions of merchandise, Customs has 5 days, 5 business days following the date of the presentation of the entry to decide if it's going to detain it. And if at the end of 5 days you hear nothing, it is presumed to be detained. Customs is permitting an immediate export. You can immediately export the goods if they're stopped. And you can do that until such time as they're excluded or seized. So I would say in the vast majority of cases, collecting the information that we're going to discuss later may not be an option. And there's going to be probably a substantial amount of these goods exported. On the other hand, the next option would be to present, if Customs chooses to the detention process and you want to challenge it, you can present evidence, and we'll talk about what that list of documents are in a little bit, but you need to provide clear and convincing evidence that the goods are not subject to the act or should be subject to an exclusion. The document is a little unclear. You have to read the whole document together to understand that that those are two different things, but if you can prove that it's outside of the act, release should be able to should follow. I do want to note that the other half of that is that if one applies for an exclusion, let's say you have a product from Xinjiang, but it is, you argue that it is not subject to forced labor, in order to approve that, it actually has to go all the way to the commissioner, who has to sign off on it, and then is compelled to advise Congress that he granted the exception. I think that we're not going to see many of those. My co-panelists can disagree with me on that, but I don't think we're going to see many of those. I think that the other piece to that you should know is any information you put in for an exclusion, which is reported to Congress, becomes public information. So your supply chain, even if it were not in the public domain before, is now public information. The next piece is customs could exclude it. If customs excludes the merchandise based on the information you provided, you're at the point now where the merchandise is in limbo, but you're entitled to protest that decision and try to raise the stakes of the evidence you provide to meet that threshold of clear and convincing evidence. Procedurally, it's no different than filing other protests, other than the fact that at least this document requires you to file it electronically in ACE to the C. Finally, customs could seize the merchandise and attempt to forfeit it, and the document will allow you to petition. What's not in the document is the normal other courses, for example, filing a court correspondence and sending it to court to immediately contest it. Right now, if it sees, the remedy, according to the document anyway, is that you can petition. I want to say that you are under a very tight time constraint. You have 30 days to file documents, which is different than, for example, under the WROs of the past, where you had 90 days to file information. Here you have 30. I will acknowledge that Alva did state that an extension is possible, and that extension would be requested of the C, and you could, at that juncture, try to get some more time. I will say, in putting these together, 30 days is a really short period. I think that the last piece of this that I think is really important in this document is for the three specific named industries, and this is towards the end of the document. There is what is called it's called Appendix A, and which are commodity specific tracing requirements. So let me say that there are two issues in play if goods come from China, and that is, number one, that the materials, cotton, polysilicon, or tomatoes, didn't come from Xinjiang or any in whole or in part. But the other piece of the equation is that you also have to prove that no forced labor was used in every tier of the supply chain. That being said, you should realize that this would also apply if we were talking to other countries. So if you have goods, for example, that the shirt example came from Vietnam, you probably don't have to prove that the labor was not forced, was forced labor, but you still have to prove that the cotton, or in fact, any part of it, did not come, the inputs did not come from Xinjiang. Without going through these very specifically, I will say that it is a great challenge for each of these, whether we're talking about cotton, whether we're talking about polysilicon, or we're talking about tomatoes. And let's just talk about polysilicon for a second. I mean, polysilicon is sand, for lack of a better description. And much of it in the world comes from China, although we have it in the United States. There's the sand the polysilicon also comes from Europe and other places. But if you think about it, we're not importing polysilicon into the United States. We're bringing in solar panels. We could be bringing in computer chips that could be made in one or more countries. If you think about, go one step further than that, it could be an automobile being imported, or machinery, or any other product that might have a computer chip in it. And so following the guidance from Elva the other day is that if you have an automobile that happens to have a computer chip in it, even though it might have been assembled in Europe, that automobile in theory could be subject to detention or seizure. So I think that these are the elements. I don't want to go through each one specifically. I trust everybody to go through the documents and look at their particular industry. But I do think that one of the things that are really helpful in this document is the list of the beginning of the lists of the type of evidence you're going to have to provide to overcome that presumption. And there's a laundry list here of documents. But in the case of, again, the hypothetical shirt, we're talking about records that go not just to a tier 1 supplier, but we're working all the way to the cotton picking. No pun intended, but it's the cotton picking records through the ginning, through the manufacture of fabric, and all the way through the different levels, which is, quite frankly, from my point of view, has been quite a challenge. At this point, I want to turn this over to Michael to sort of put the overlay of the DHS document so that we can get a picture, even a bigger picture.
Mike, before you start, Richard, just for purposes of clarification, you mentioned earlier, and quite correctly, that the option to export exists. But I believe the way Customs is interpreting that is it exists only until they either quote unquote exclude or seize. Do you agree with that?
That is correct. It is until it is either seized, seized or excluded, but during the detention period should be fine. So you have to make that decision quickly. I think I think that you're right to raise that there is a line in the sand there.
The only other thing I would add, Mike, before you start, is that Robert put a link in the chat box, which is a screen from CBP showing you where the WRO orders are that are currently in place, which is significant only to make the point that it doesn't necessarily have to come from China to be subject to the forced labor rules. And with that, Mike, please take over.
Great, thank you. Just wait a cotton picking minute. Sorry, I had to pick up on Richard's pun. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about, hopefully this shows, I guess it's not showing very well with the virtual background. There we go. This is the DHS document. It's in the link. Click on below. There should be in the chat box a link for it. But this is the document put out by DHS, Department of Homeland Security. You know, CBP in this process is, of course, the main sort of foot soldier on the ground. They also have a seat at the table, but a lot of the strategy around enforcement is coming from Homeland Security and this FLETF, or the Forced Labor Enforcement Committee that exists, which is made up of representatives from different agencies. So this is not only a CBP show, as Zelva pointed out. They just happen to be the boots on the ground where the containers or the planes arrive and they have to implement it. But enforcement decisions are laid out and by law in this new, different people call it different things. I'm going to steal Heather Littman's way of pronouncing the acronym, the UFLPA. Some people say UFLPA, but the new law, the one that Richard said was passed on his birthday, that's the law we're talking about here. And it mandates that there be a strategy for how to go about enforcing it, because frankly, it's kind of, as you can tell, and as people are, I don't want to say flipping out, but getting stressed out a lot or a little by this new law, it's a big deal. It's a big elephant. And even the government has to eat the elephant one bite at a time, to use an overused expression. They can't possibly stop everything. They have limited resources, limited people. So they have to figure out sort of what's more important than other. And I think even Elva alluded to that during her webinar the other day in talking about how, yes, technically small value shipments could be subject to this as well. They are, not could be, they are subject to this. But as a practical matter, I would say the odds of, $1,000 product coming into the country being stopped versus a container load, again, CBP has to focus its priorities. Anyway, lest I digress, you definitely do want to take a look at that document, the enforcement strategy that I'm going to talk about. It's a little bit lengthy, but to me, the key parts for what importers need to know are found mainly around pages 18 to 30 or somewhere around there. And there's a little bit towards the end as well. And there's a bunch of legalese, but I'm here to kind of give you what I hope is the punchline, the takeaway. But do look at it. It's not that hard to kind of navigate through. I think the first thing I would point out is, and Richard was alluding to this, as customs lawyers or trade lawyers, we're so used to thinking about goods, things that are tangible, right? People say, oh, you work with customs, my aunt is stuck at the airport. Can you help? And I know I do goods. I don't do people, right? I don't do the immigration part. I'm a goods guy. But there's a big aspect of this dealing with the labor. And I think Richard alluded to this. The labor needs to be looked at. You could have goods produced in the eastern part of China, which, by the way, let me just take a quick digression, and this may not show, but map of China here, again, I don't know if you can see it, but the Xinjiang region is all the way up in the northwest corner. And while that's kind of ground zero for the enforcement of this, you can be making goods in the eastern part of China or central, or frankly, anywhere other than Xinjiang province and still have issues. So I guess my first advice is don't think this is limited to just that one province, and Sue and others have already mentioned it's much broader than that. So anyway, within China and in this document and under the statute, they are required to identify what entities, meaning companies or corporate people, are involved in different types of forced labor and to publish those entities. So there's, at least from the US point of view, I'll call it a bad guy list or a prohibited kind of party list. And if you already do denied party screening and things like that with software to check purchases through that, hopefully no one is going to be buying directly from them, but there's now a list of entities that you should incorporate, or your software provider probably will incorporate. But as you dig into the supply chain and map out your supply chain and start talking to your suppliers, whether it's tier 1 or tier 8 or whatever the tier, you need to have an eye open to see if these entities are involved in the supply chain, because this document, the Homeland Security document, puts everyone on notice on what those entities are. And that's as of now. It will change over time. Some will be added, more will be added, more will be added. Maybe some will be taken off. I don't know. But you want to look at that and make sure you know who those entities are. And the entities are companies that right now the government here is saying are using forced labor or are trafficking in forced labor, and so on. So that's probably, to me, one of the most important parts about this document is it's telling you the names. Second thing in the document that's important is on the good side. Remember I said I'm a guy who deals in goods, not people. On the good side, they're telling what their enforcement priorities are in terms of goods, and meaning sectors. And it was mentioned already, cotton, tomatoes, silica, and apparel. Those 4 things are called out in the document. So if you're not in those industries, you happen to be in the pen industry, I'm not saying you should let your guard down, but you can probably breathe a little easier than the person who's importing the shirt that's on Richard's back. So knowing what the priorities are from customs, and I think even Elva mentioned those commodities as well, that's certainly what they're going to be targeting so far. But as I'm also telling clients, while you can breathe and relax if you're not in those industries, you should not be complacent about this, because over time, I firmly believe, especially as US-China tensions continue to mount and grow, that list will expand. So you don't want to be caught flat-footed, and you need to know. The cotton, for example, again, the shirt's kind of an easy, obvious example. I was talking to someone the other day who will remain nameless, but they're in the electronics industry, and leaving aside the silica aspect, they would normally think, well, tomatoes, yeah, we don't do tomatoes. Apparel, no, not really. Maybe the occasional t-shirt with the company logo, but we're not really apparel importer. But they make, other things like headphones, those comfy headphones that have cotton inside the foam that goes on your ears or inside there, or on their speaker panels or things like that. So you could have cotton in your supply chain. Granted, you're going to be a much smaller cotton player, but you need to at least start making efforts to figure out who's in your supply chain and whether they're identified as one of the entities, or whether or not they have forced labor. One other practical point, and I'm going to maybe stop here. Actually, no, two things. At the end of the document, towards the end, most of the so-called importer guidance is in CBP's document. There are steps that are mentioned in the DHS document and the strategy document about what they think companies should be doing. They call it recommendations for stakeholder engagements. And there's a list. I'm not going to read it off here, but it's on page 54, 55. That's kind of a high level overview. It should give you an idea of the kinds of different things your company should be doing. Certainly, if you're sourcing in those 4 industries, apparel, cotton, tomatoes, and silica. But even if you're not, I would say this is the time to develop a forced labor social responsibility kind of program if you don't have one already. And if you do, you need to look at this and make sure you're covering all the bases. But my last comment, which is just a practical one, why is this important? I always tell people the best advice I can give someone, it's horrible for me. If you can get out of the import business, do it, right? Then you don't have to deal with all this, someone else's headache. The stated goal here, I think, well, maybe it's unstated, but it seems clear to me, is to discourage people from sourcing, yes, goods made with forced labor, but really, to lower your risk profiles. I don't want to be so blunt, get out of China if you can. Meaning, right, with the 301 tariffs we had, that was, ostensibly about US economic interests and damage and theft of US IP, intellectual property and such. But, Lighthizer said more than once, and they said this too, when they would deny exclusions for people when they wouldn't renew them. We gave you enough time to get out of China. Why are you still there? Was basically the gist of what they said. So I think there's a lot of that going on here too. A lot of this is geopolitical. So I say all that to say, if you can lower your risk profile that way, that's the easiest way not to get rid of it, because as Richard said, Sue said, you could be making that shirt in Vietnam, say, oh, good, I'm out of China. I don't buy anything out of China. But yet your supplier in Vietnam gets all their raw materials from China, for example. You're still in China for all intents and purposes. So I think the goal is to kind of use this as leverage in our dealings with China. I won't pontificate anymore beyond that. Maybe we should open up to questions, or if Sue or Richard want to add to that.
I think the only thing I would add, Mike, is sort of a general comment. If you haven't figured out by now, what all 3 of us are saying is this is a royal pain in the, to be polite, posterior. And it should immediately cause you to go, and you can use your favorite 4-letter word after the word O. Because it is no longer a question of who am I buying from, who's my first tier supplier. you're going to have to get to the point where you can either get to the second, third, maybe fourth, but all the way back to the raw materials. And we're lawyers, so our first reaction is to say, well, if you're a supplier to one of my suppliers, how much are you really going to be willing to tell us? And so while Customs has sort of nonchalantly said, well, the first step for every importer is, sort of organize, write out, figure out what is your supply chain. Well, you know that if you're a CTPAT member because you figured out who you're sourcing from. That's not what they mean. They mean now go to the second tier, the third tier, the fourth tier, the fifth tier supplier, so that you can actually, on the day we decide to detain the goods, give us everything that says, no, this stuff was not made in China.
Well, by the way, Sue, sorry, let me interrupt real quick.
Please.
I forgot my practical point, which is when I was talking about like getting out of the import business or maybe consider if you can get out of China. The point here, to me, that's just a very practical, not a legal observation. You have 30 days to get this information, as has been said. Good luck with that. You're going to need more time. But even if you get it in 30 days, all right, great. On day 30, let's say you get it on day 2, which is never going to happen. But say you get it on day 2, not day 30, not day 50, day 2. You hand over your big stack or U-Haul or PDFs over to Customs. Here's all the documents. Guess what? Now you're waiting in line at the bakery for Customs to call your number. So it's not like in 30 days this is resolved. And that means impact your supply chain is going to be enormous, even if you have the goods, so to speak.
Well, and I think one of the reasons that we gave you the handouts that we did is you'll see that there is a ruling included where there are comments made about the quality of the forced labor paperwork. A third-party report that had been submitted that was found to have too many details in it that were discrepant. We also gave you from the good old days, from when we all remember textile quotas, and is still getting used today. When Customs comes to you and says, prove to me the origin of your garment, sticking with Richard's shirt example, there is a laundry list of things you have to pull together. And one of the things that Customs has said in its guidance document is that you should turn it in English. Well, I don't think any of us believes that Customs doesn't check at least some of the translations. But if you give this to them in a way that what you do is you basically say, here's the documents, that's a real mess. They have to be properly organized. They have to be properly explained. You want to make sure that if you said, I've got, 100 yards of X fabric, that's enough to generate all the garments in your shipment and so on. So this is really, I think Elva and the team from Customs that did the briefing on Tuesday pretty much said exactly what you said, Mike. The goal of this is to get everybody out of China. Now, how successful it will be remains to be seen. So, Mark, do we have any questions in the chat box? I didn't see any.
Yeah, I don't see any yet, but I guess I would like to, if you could follow up on some of that advice about asking your supplier on down to the raw material. And I, the trade nerds that I hang around with, that is the big question. We've got, client confidentiality. Everyone's afraid, especially in China, about me going around them to the next level down. I'm wondering if you can talk about potential strategies there, and or rumors that I have heard about China specifically working to block Chinese suppliers from being able to provide
screwdriver I
that.
have that's like, it's like got a
Hang on
golden
a second.
handle.
Scott, you're on mute. If you could go back. Thanks, Scott. So yeah, if you could give any comments about if that's in fact correct or just rumor, or how do we get down to find out if there is any cotton in a automobile, which is kind of a challenge.
In the seats.
Yeah.
There's a lot of points in there, Mark. So let's talk about number one, China making it difficult to get information. We understand that there have been, for lack of a better legal term, I'm going to call them edicts, because I'm not sure what they are under Chinese law, not to provide information. Moreover, they have made examples of certain high-end brands where they've essentially told the brand, you've asked the wrong question, so therefore you are closing in China. And by the way, you no longer own your intellectual property in China. We, the government, now own your brand. And we can sell it anywhere we want because we're China. So that's piece number one. I think the other piece is really stepping back for a second and saying, how do I test my supply chain up front? I mean, we're all very focused on how are we going to get these goods, but I've been working with many of my clients who are like, how can we stress test our line? So of course, part of that is obtaining all of these documents that Mike and Sue talked about. But there are other service providers out there. There are a number of artificial intelligence companies. Now, I'm going to say that the information is not the be-all, end-all. So with at least one of them, I reviewed live what they were looking at, and essentially it's manifest data worldwide, which got you, and back in the shirt example, it got us perhaps to the fabric supplier. But for those of you who are in the business of textiles, you know that much of movement in China before that is just the company's local truck. So there's no public record of the movement of anything. So what the artificial intelligence does do, however, is it pieces together relationships. And so we've seen situations. I had one just the other day where where we did, we could only really trace back to the grayish goods. We could not go any farther. But one of the relationships it developed was that the grayish good manufacturer also had a related facility in Xinjiang, which manufactured sodium hydroxide, or to the uneducated rest of us, bleach, that they use to lighten the products. And so what we've learned from customs in the past is not only is the evidence about something itself being bad, but if it could be guilt by association because you have a related factory or some relationship or previous purchasing pattern from a facility. But having said all of that, these different resources, some of them that help you organize your records, others that provide artificial intelligence, are very helpful. I will also say they're very expensive. And so what we've really determined is that it's great if you're a Fortune 500 company. It's great if you're a large company, but if you're, an entrepreneur and do 20, 30, $40 million a year, spending, in excess of $500,000 a year to use artificial intelligence is not a viable solution. But at a minimum, stress testing and trying to see how far you could get from your 1 or 2 or 3 key vendors is really important. And what we have found uniformly is that we could get a few levels into a few tiers into the supply chain, but we're never getting to the cotton. We're probably not getting to the grayish goods even. We're getting to the fabric. Maybe we're getting to dyeing beyond that. We're not getting much farther. In the polysilicon, I'm sorry, Sue.
No, finish your thought.
Well, I'm going to say in the polysilicon, it's even more difficult because customs is very concerned, and this is true in cotton also, about commingling. So you could be using, you could have arranged for polysilicon that came from the United States, but that factory had sometime historically used Chinese polysilicon. That could be customs is concerned about commingling. The same is true about cotton. We've had detentions under the WRO. We've had WRO shipments stopped where we know that the cotton came from the United States. The United States has the best records in the world by batch of cotton, but we still couldn't prove that the labor in every single tier of that production was not forced labor. And proving the negative is next to impossible.
So what I was going to add to that, Richard, is you're absolutely right. This has become very much a situation where the US wants everybody to get out of China. There are a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about why that is the case. But what it does mean is that the due diligence that you now perform really becomes that much more complicated. And like you, Richard, our experience is maybe you can get to the third tier if you're really lucky.
Right.
And that's usually because there's either the buying clout, like, the Walmart effect that we all kid about, or because the parties are related.
Mhm.
But one of the key things, well, one of the key pieces of advice that everybody has been giving, talking specifically about dealing with China, is when you start asking the questions about how do you find the people that you hire? How do you qualify them? What benefits are you providing them, and so on, because that now becomes a whole other set of questions that you ask relative to forced labor. You cannot ask it in the context of forced labor when you ask it of China. You have to be sophisticated about how you ask it. Otherwise, your Chinese supplier is in violation of local law, which they aren't going to do for you. So even if you have the ability, you're going to have challenges.
Yeah, the other thing it would be interesting to hear your perspective of. It's my understanding that part of the accusation that is brought, either determined by CBP or brought by an NGO or somebody, is showing this relationship, showing a transactional record and a chain of custody, if you will, from one party to another. It's am I correct to understand? I just can't accuse Michael Roll of bringing in pens from China that are made with forced labor. I actually have to have some documentation presented to CBP to show that his ink comes from Xinjiang.
Yeah.
I don't, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, since I'm the accused here.
Yeah, but you know a couple good lawyers at least.
Yes, if it takes me 20 years, I'm sure I'll get no. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think customs, again, they have limited resources. When people go and they present stuff to the government, every day they're getting information. They need to vet that. And so if they just say, hey, Mike's a dirty pen importer, brings in all that stuff from Xinjiang, you're going to need more. I firmly believe that. I don't work for the government, of course, but that accuser or that alleger is going to need more, because the government's going to have to dedicate resources now on that issue, right? Even if it means stopping pen shipments, they need to do that on something that's more than just someone said. And
Well, I would tend to disagree. And what I want to say is that customs is using much what are referred to as open source information. Open source information, for lack of a better descriptor, is like the Twitters of the world. And I'm not sure what the Chinese version of Twitter is, but at some point or another, if a factory is mentioned, that's really has been enough. It was enough under the WROs, and certainly it's enough here. That one never knows the accuracy of the information that customs is relying on. But certainly, if it's out from open source information. Having said that, one of the activities that I've recommended to some clients is use Chinese character equivalents of Google and go check your supply chain out. See if they're mentioned. Are they mentioned just because they have a factory, or is they mentioned because they have labor problems or they have some other issue? And interestingly enough, a couple of clients have come and reported back, we found some information. We don't know what it means, but they have found information, and the finding of information was quite troubling to them.
Yeah, just on that point, I think I'm not sitting in the room at customs, but I think the debate is probably more over the quality of the open source information. I still would doubt very highly that if there's a single reference somewhere because someone is tweeting once the name of someone, that they're going to just say, okay, let's add that to the list of people we're going to target. There's a guy who's out on Twitter. I'm trying to find his Twitter handle. It's Atomica Andy Hall is his name, but he's a prolific, I'll call him worker rights advocate, who tweets all the time about stuff he's doing in Southeast Asia, not so much in China to my knowledge. But the point is, he may tweet something, but there's going to be more to it than just a tweet. They just can't be that the government is going to spend the limited resources it has.
I don't disagree, but as most people in at least in the apparel industry are aware, there have been certain lists that have been published, one by an English university, and it names both customers in the United States, big retailers and wholesalers, but it also identifies sources. And there's been one or two other similar lists. What none of us have is the backup to that. But
Yeah,
some
correct.
of those lists became gospel.
Well, but you just hit the nail on the head, Richard, which is, Mark, your point about how much information is enough isn't really a fair one. Not that you shouldn't have asked the question, but what we've heard out of customs consistently is we're using open source. You should do the same. So it's going to be like any other sort of quote unquote whistleblower situation. If I'm an NGO, and by the way, let's be very clear that what's unique here is that the NGOs are at the table, and they're what's coming out of their mouths is being given a lot of gospel, whether or not they can back it up. And that's been one of the challenges. I mean, as we know as lawyers, there's a case working its way through the courts involving palm oil, where the whole question was, the importer said to customs, well, we've given you everything and you're still telling us we have a problem, but you won't tell us what it is you have that's the problem. And so they've had to enter into what we commonly see as an agreement for confidentiality so that the importer can get access to the records. And so this is going to continue to be a problem. The short answer, Mark, is you can turn over anything. The longer answer is what Mike and Richard said, which is the more detailed it is, the faster customs can act on it. But we've certainly seen cases in a lot of different circumstances, not just here, where it's based on nothing more really than rumor, and it all of a sudden becomes a big deal.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful about that. And I do think that for a lot of companies, the decision is going to have to be made that they're just going to have to change their supply chain, more than just going out of China, but asking more questions and at least getting written assurances. Because even though we've been told by customs that at least initially, they're going to enforce this more at the detention stage than at the seizure or penalty stage, customs has also made very clear from the outset they will use whichever tool they have in their toolbox to get the importer's attention. And if they feel you're ignoring them, they will seize and they will penalize.
Just, I want to echo what Richard said earlier, though, and I think Sue, you mentioned it as well, but stress testing or doing a, kind of a fire drill, even if you get imperfect information, you're only going down to tier 2 or tier 3 or whatever, however far back, is still a valuable exercise, because right now, beyond tier 1, you're blind, number one, presumably. And the more you learn about who's in your supply chain, the more you can, maybe at tier 3, there's a company that, again, you're not going to tier 4, 5, and 6, but at tier 3, there's, Acme company, his name, and then you're doing your research and wow, Acme company's been accused of this, that, and the other thing. So the more information you have to, that's a very, so you just said it, the expectation clearly is that you importer are going to know your supply chain in much more depth than what you're used to knowing.
So
the wrinkle being that you can't trust anything you get from the person in China, right? You can't, I'm saying, right? But isn't this the issue, right?
Well, but hold on a second. We're dealing with law enforcement here, okay? And law enforcement always is suspicious. And I've dealt with enough law enforcement outside the import arena and the export arena to tell you that that's true across the board. Customs has seen a lot of what we'll politely call shenanigans going on with trade with China. So let's talk for the last couple of minutes we have on just giving some, what are best practices. The first one is, map your supply chain. The second one is, to the extent that you have a purchase order, you have a I started to use the shorthand. you have a representation and warranty from your supplier that they are not using forced labor, and that they're, you know, besides the usual quality and dollar and timeless and all of that, having that doesn't get you off the hook, but it's a start in the direction of showing that you've conducted due diligence. Do not ever expect that customs is just going to stop when you give them an affidavit, if that's what you try to do, from your supplier in China who says, well, I don't use forced labor, because customs answer is going to be, show me the documents. Mike, Richard, other 2 or 3 suggestions you have for either importers or their service providers on things to be looking for before we get to the, you know, pick the right expert to help you here so that it gets done right the first time question?
I'll just add one thing and quickly. I think within your company here, raise awareness, right? You know, if you're here listening, I'm assuming you're in the trade function or logistics or something, but you got to get management support, and at the top levels of the company, whether that's the CEO or a senior VP or whomever, the higher up you go to raise awareness, because you're going to need support from a lot of people to start getting this information out of China. And you got to tell them this is real, because it is. I mean, I would predict safely that Sue, Richard, and I, and a bunch of other customs lawyers are going to be quite busy on these issues, and that alone should tell you that this is real. That's
Richard,
my one.
Richard, do you have any other comments other than you're putting a down payment on a new Porsche?
Well, I only wish. No, you know, look, I think that the most important thing have been mentioned. I mean, really creating and mapping a supply chain and really testing the documents with the understanding that you need to trust but verify even the documents you get. You know, without casting any aspersions, back in the quota years, you know, we used to see, it was magical to me how quickly and perfectly documents appeared in my office. And, you know, you know, you want to almost become suspicious if the documents are too good. I want to leave with one last thought, though, and that is, and you don't often hear me say nice things about customs, but I will say during the WRO period, which we have to roll that experience into this, because I think that that's the stepping stone to get where we are. Customs has been really pretty surgical about where they're stopping goods. You know, while we had some which I couldn't understand why they were stopped, they were the outliers. I mean, the ones that customs stopped, there was usually something. Now, we may never get to the bottom of what that something is, but there really was, customs has been pretty surgical. And I think given the resources, although customs under the most recent act get 200 people to start reviewing this stuff, but that's going to take a couple of years till they're, you know, fully on board and trained. And I think that the last piece to this is that as you stress test, you also have to start beginning the process of writing what a response might look like. The reason for that is that you need to be able to tell a story. Every story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what I have found is, even if the documents look wonderful, you know, until you start putting the story together and creating a timeline of what happened, and you know, I mean, you know, it's only then that you find out that, well, you know, you needed 31 tons of cotton to make this, and there were 42 tons, or some other thing that might not pop out at you until you create the story and the timeline.
So not to interrupt your thought, Richard, but somebody who I know and has my cell phone number just sent what I think is a great closing question. So Mark, bear with us if we go a minute or two over. And it says, if doing something or taking some steps is which are feasible is never going to be enough, what is to keep one from pondering what is the point of doing that? Understanding there is the underlying and good practice of showing CBP you are taking things seriously. My answer to that would be, you don't know that it's not feasible until you try, number one. Number two, it helps you to decide whether you can or should be changing suppliers. It is an eye-opening experience to, as we've had with some of our clients, particularly in the WRO context, to have a conversation with a supplier that you always thought was reliable, to only have them turn around and basically shut you down. So yes, the US is becoming the police of the world, if you will, on trying to impose the forced labor standards that we have on other countries. But it's still a fair question. You know, what is it that you would say to your clients if they've done, as we have talked about, mapped the supply chain, you know, asked for the documents, gotten as far as they can go? You know, what else?
I think you hit that on the head already. It's not, you don't know it's pointless until you do it. And I would say actually, and in my office at least, we've done these dives beyond tier one, and you're like, oh wow, you buy from so-and-so who supplies palm oil, and they're on, you know, there's a finding on them. Like, you would have never known that had you not asked the question.
Absolutely. I think that you that is a huge takeaway, and we do need to stop this, because although we could continue on forever, I really appreciate your time and your thoughts, Sue, Richard, and Michael. If you're looking for NCBFAA credits on this, contact our office and we'll work those details out. But they should be available. I know we applied for those. Also, if you haven't yet applied for the CBP Trade Facilitation and Cargo Security Summit, encourage you to do that. A few seats available for the FTA Customs Brokers Test Preparation class, and an in-person mixer on July 28th. We look forward to working with you again and supporting you. Again, we'd encourage your membership at the Foreign Trade Association. It's your membership that helps us present situations or events like this, and we will be posting this on our YouTube site. So with that, I'll say thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, FTA.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye-bye.